Let's dive right into this explainer and forensically break down exactly how James Joyce essentially rewired literature forever with his revolutionary novel. We're going to look really closely at the mechanics, the history, and the psychology behind A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, exploring exactly how it works on a granular level.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, contexts of a modernist. Second, architecture of the novel. Third, Stephen's mind and theories. Fourth, revolutionary narrative techniques. And fifth, the psychoanalytic and critical legacy.
So think about this for a second. How do you actually capture the chaotic, messy reality of the human mind on a printed page? That is the massive, foundational question Joyce set out to answer. But before we unravel the specific literary techniques he used to solve this puzzle, we really have to zoom out. We need to look at the turbulent world that shaped him, because, well, the human mind doesn't just exist in a vacuum.
Section 1. Contexts of a modernist. The socio-political, biographical, and literary roots of literary revolution.
The socio-political landscape of Catholic Ireland fundamentally anchors the emotional reality of this entire book. You have Charles Stewart Parnell, who was a beloved Irish nationalist leader. His political downfall, which was largely driven by a scandal and his subsequent abandonment by the Catholic Church, completely fractured the national psyche. And this historical trauma translates directly into the novel's explosive Christmas dinner debate. In that famous scene, these vicious arguments over Parnell's betrayal vividly illustrate the paralyzing grip that both Irish politics and religion held over the people, and specifically over a young Stephen Dedalus.
And you really can't separate Stephen from Joyce himself. There are super clear biographical echoes in the novel, showing how Joyce's own unstable upbringing, poverty, and elite Jesuit education were mirrored perfectly in Stephen's life. The family's descent into poverty forced constant relocations all over Dublin, fostering this deep sense of rootlessness. Meanwhile, the rigorous, highly structured Jesuit education at places like Clongowes Wood College provided him with intellectual fuel, sure, but it was also a deeply restrictive environment. It was an environment that Joyce and Stephen ultimately felt compelled to escape through self-imposed exile in Paris and Trieste.
Culturally, Joyce was pulling inspiration from all across the continent, brilliantly fusing two distinct European modernist movements. He took the harsh scientific exactitude and objective reality of naturalism, the kind championed by writers like Émile Zola and Henrik Ibsen, and tempered it with the rich, private suggestiveness of French symbolism. This intersection was a total game-changer. It allowed Joyce to evoke the gritty, real-world squalor of Dublin while simultaneously elevating it into a profound, highly subjective psychological experience.
Section 2. Architecture of the novel. Structure, genre, and the dual narration.
Let's first define the Bildungsroman. This is your classic novel of personal growth, and Joyce definitely leans on this framework. He's tracing Stephen's journey from a naive infant experiencing very basic sensory details like warm and cold sheets to a complex, independent adult grappling with heavy moral issues.
But Joyce doesn't stop there. He layers in the Kunstlerroman, which is a narrative specifically focused on the artistic formation and maturation of a young creator. So the crucial point here is that Joyce's work sits perfectly right at the intersection of both genres. It functions as an aesthetic autobiography that documents a boy growing up, while at the exact same time discovering his artistic vocation.
Now let's look at the actual structural blueprint. The novel consists of 5 chapters divided into 19 distinct typographical units. But rather than a traditional linear plot of escalating action, the novel's structure operates remarkably like a wave. Each chapter builds up to a triumphant crest of synthesis, a moment of clarity or a spiritual high, only for the next chapter to plunge Stephen right back down into a psychological trough of squalid reality and depression. This constant rise and fall perfectly mimics the chaotic stop-and-start rhythm of actual psychological development.
At the heart of this structure is the concept of dual consciousness, which is absolutely essential for understanding how the story is told. Joyce masterfully aligns Stephen's immediate, naive, and emotionally volatile experiences with a mature, ironic narrator. Think of this narrator as an invisible director who regulates our emotional distance from the boy's dramatic flair. Sometimes we are right there, deep in Stephen's intimate thoughts, and other times the narrator pulls us back just enough to see Stephen's youthful arrogance or foolishness with a sense of subtle, humorous irony.
Section 3. Stephen's mind and theories. Psychological evolution and secularized aesthetics.
If we track Stephen's psychological evolution, we watch him journey from a sensory-driven infant in that famous baby tuckoo phase straight into an adolescence marked by severe crises of religious guilt and a sexual awakening in the squalid brothel quarters. Next, we hit his young adulthood, where he outright rejects the rigid order of the priesthood in favor of his artistic awakening at the estuary. Finally, he evolves into an isolated collegiate artist, adopting his ultimate defensive creed just to survive: silence, exile, and cunning.
During those collegiate years, Stephen develops a fascinating secularized translation of St. Thomas Aquinas' aesthetic theory. This is really the intellectual peak of his evolution. He takes Aquinas' religious concepts of beauty and completely strips away the moral obligations. Instead, he defines art through strict psychological standards. First, integritas, seeing the object as one whole thing. Second, consonantia, recognizing its harmony and proportion. And third, quiddatus, the whatness or the radiant secular truth of the object itself.
Now, it's worth noting that throughout this mental evolution, Stephen displays a real inability to view women comprehensively. He permanently polarizes them into two distinct, mutually exclusive categories. On one hand, they are maternal or religious traps, figures of conformity and possession, like his mother or his governess Dante, who block his path to freedom. On the other hand, they become these liberating symbols of artistic inspiration, like the prostitute who offers him release, or the waiting girl on the beach who sparks his creative destiny.
Section 4. Revolutionary Narrative Techniques. Modulation of styles, stream of consciousness, and symbols. This is one of the coolest parts. Notice how the language of the novel actually grows up right alongside the protagonist. Joyce literally modulates the style of the prose to match Stephen's exact age. It starts off with simple, infantile nursery rhymes. Then it shifts into rough schoolboy slang during his time at Clongowes. Later, it sweeps into this exalted, highly dramatic romantic lyricism during his teenage crises. Finally, it ends in the fragmented, sharp diary entries of an independent, modern thinker getting ready to leave Ireland. The style literally is the substance. Joyce constructs this reality utilizing the stream of consciousness technique, heavily relying on associative memories. Think of how Stephen's mind naturally links the physical coldness of the football field directly back to the traumatic memory of a wet ditch he was pushed into. Joyce also weaves these incredibly fluid, evolving symbols throughout the text, like water, birds, and the colors green and red, all while using remarkably tight syntactic structures. By piling on dense adjectives and modifying phrases, Joyce achieves what critics often call a mean scrupulousness, a brilliant, exact textural density. Which brings us to the famous epiphany at the estuary. Joyce defined an epiphany as a sudden spiritual manifestation. Structurally, this moment serves as the massive climax of the fourth chapter. The sight of a beautiful, bird-like waiting girl in the water suddenly transforms Stephen's agonizing religious guilt into a rapturous, joyous acceptance of his artistic destiny. It is just this perfect fusion of technique, symbol, and a major psychological breakthrough. Section 5. Psychoanalytic and Critical Legacy. Debates on Distance and the Lacanian Identity. Looking back, early scholarship was completely dominated by a central critical debate. Some early critics, like Hugh Kenner and Wayne Booth, actually viewed the shifting narrative distance as a flaw or an artistic failure. They argued Joyce's attitude towards Stephen was just too vague. But defenders, like Harry Levin, proved otherwise. Levin and others argued that this dual consciousness wasn't a failure at all. It was actually Joyce's greatest modernist innovation, perfectly capturing both raw intimacy and careful, ironic control.
Today, we can also view the novel through a modern Lacanian psychoanalytic lens. This approach basically argues that Stephen's identity isn't a fixed, static thing. Instead, he is an assemblage of signifiers, constantly shaped by psychological feelings of lack and desire. When Stephen separates from his maternal environment, that feeling of loss forces him into language. In this view, Stephen literally writes himself into existence, using his feelings of sundering and loss to constantly shatter and rebuild his identity through words. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought on the sheer power of language. Joyce showed us that language isn't just a tool to reflect reality. It is the very mechanism we use to actively construct who we are. If you take away anything from the architecture of Stephen Daedalus's mind, let it be that we all hold the pen to our own aesthetic autobiographies. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep exploring.